So, in consideration to that idea, the earthen house which man builds is also a reference in a body also. But instead of it being a spiritual house, as is the inner man, it's a building of natural proportions, our own natural bodies, since we use it to worship God in our own way, i.e., ritualistic worship practices that were not ordained nor desired by God, as I will go over in much detail in and I call it my upcoming book, but it's now published. And also, I'm reading that book as well, which is a surprising dismissal of water baptism and the communion, carnal ordinances, part 2, the naturalistic world that come to an end. We need to understand how we today can apply the message of Isaiah chapter 1 to our own worshiping routines, especially in verses 11 through 15. Am I going to be quoting that in a minute? Well, I guess if I do quote it, I'll go ahead and put that up here on the screen so you can see it. Of course, we did not literally build these earthen houses ourselves, even though technically our parents really did. See Genesis 5:3. But once again, how we actually build is with how we worship God in fleshly ritualistic formalities, and of how we can make this body a den of thieves, a house of carnality. Let's go to Romans 6:13a. Neither yield you your members, that is, your natural body parts, such as your arms, your mouth, etc. Don't yield your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin. Go to verse 19. I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of your flesh. Whereas you have yielded your members, again, your arms, your mouth, etc. As you yielded your members servants to uncleanness and to iniquity unto iniquity, even so now, yield you your members servants to righteousness and to holiness. Do we actually imagine that these verses are being used simply for the ungodly people of the world, of their sinful actions in the world? Friends, these verses were written to Christians, toward those who had brought and are bringing carnality into the presence of the Lord, people of whom are supposed to be the good examples for the rest of the world. Again, not just things that we do out in the world, but especially what we bring into the solemn assembly, exposing our flesh during worshiping services. But yes, it's also how we should show ourselves out in the world also. Aren't we supposed to be his ambassadors out here? See 2 Corinthians 5:28. His representatives in the world? Again, I'm going to explain my take on all of these things in my aforementioned book, of which I do explain it, in Carnal Ordinances Part 2, the surprise and dismissal, water baptism, and the communion, of how all these kinds of verses can especially apply to Christians who worship God with the flesh, of which ritualistic practices cannot make the participant who does those kinds of services perfect as pertaining to the conscience, as it says in Hebrews 9:9. For, and I'm going to speak metaphorically here, if the blood of bulls and of goats and of the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean does sanctify to the purifying of the flesh, that is, fleshly movements of worship practices, but of which can only symbolize true cleansing, then how much more shall the blood of Christ, the Holy Ghost, that is, who through the eternal Spirit had offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Hebrews 9:13 through 14. That is, dead works being those ritualistic practices. Let's go to Galatians 3:3. Are you so foolish? Having begun in the Spirit, are you now made perfect by the flesh? Romans 7:5. For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sins which were by the law did work in our members, again, our arms and our mouths, etc. Let me reread that. They did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. Now let's go to Romans 7:23. I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. 1 Corinthians 6:15. See, the reason why, going back to Romans 7:23, he saw another law in his members, and it brought him to the captivity to the law of sin, which was in his members. That means he was worshiping God in fleshly formalities. That's what it's talking about. So let's go to 1 Corinthians 6:15. Know ye not that your bodies are the members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them the members of a harlot? God forbid. Now, all of which tells us that such motions of the flesh are mere symbolisms. They're not true worship. But being only symbolisms, which they did do in the Old Testament times, and they were ordained to do so back then, but only until the time of Reformation, Hebrews 9:10, of which time was when Jesus had died on the cross, and indeed the day of Pentecost just afterwards, tells us today that such things now need to be actually lived out in our everyday lives, not just in symbolisms, but not done ritualistically anymore, but to do what the rituals actually stood for. Not only so, but such literal rituals were confined to a literal building, first in the tabernacle in the wilderness, then in the actual building by Solomon, and then by Herod. But when the building was torn down, that was in AD 70 by the armies of Rome, when that building was torn down by God, God ordained it to fall. Or else, can anybody really knock something down like that? That was called the house of God without God's ordination. When the building was torn down, all the rituals went out the door. They were gone. Therefore, we must ask, if any rituals are now done indoors during these New Testament times, are the participants justified in doing them? But seriously, is it really possible that such ordinances, rituals, can be considered so bad to God, to where he'd consider it a fleshly act of worshiping instead of a godly spiritual act? In this case, I'm defining ordinances, as I just mentioned, as the ritualistic practices of the body, instead of simply defining the word as a law, as I had gone over very well in the last chapter of my book, The Church and the Fivefold Ministry, Should We Put in our Trust in Man, Carnal Ordinances, Part 1. But let's read Ephesians 2:15a to make this a little more clear. Having abolished in his flesh, that's when he died on the cross, the enmity, which was his enemy, even which was the law of commandments that were contained in ordinances. See, that's not just a law, but it's the law that was contained in the ordinances, showing us a distinction between just the law only and the ritual practices of the law. For the law itself was spiritual and it was good, as Paul says in Romans 7:12. So that wasn't what became God's enemy. It was the ordinances, the rituals, of which he had eventually nailed to his cross, as is seen in Colossians 2:14, of what had died with his natural body. Because, and as is explained in the Old Testament, he got tired of people using them instead of real and true dedication and worship. They were really poor replacements. So now, instead of us trying to worship him through such ordinances, again, ritualistic practices, ritualistic worship that's done by our natural body parts, our members, he took those ordinances completely out of the way, as it talks about in Colossians 2:20 through chapter 3, verse 2. But in my upcoming book, again, that's already published now, because you can see this book was published prior to it, of Carnal Ordinances Part 2, The Surprising Dismissal of Water Baptism and Communion, which is already published. I'm going to show how cardinal ordinances from Hebrews 9:10 had actually crept back into the church, but in new and different formalities. They're kind of hidden there. With such a thought, I had asked, again in the last chapter of my book on the Church and the Fivefold Ministry, of whether all these ordinances can only be understood as the ritualistic practices of the Old Testament, but have no bearing on folks bringing carnal fleshly worship into God's church today. Is that a good question? Is it truly possible that such carnal worshiping practices are happening in our modern times, right in the church building? That is, again, that people are bringing fleshly baggage into the assembling of God's people. I think that's a pretty good question. Is it possible also that the children of Israel is it possible also that the children of Israel brought Egypt with them into the wilderness, to where just as soon as they thought that God had turned his back, had begun to construct a false idol with the riches of Egypt, of which gold and jewels they had actually brought with them from that ungodly place? See Exodus 32, verses 7 through 8. Is it true that it only takes a little bit of leaven to leaven an entire lump? See 1 Corinthians 5:6, Galatians 5:9, and Matthew 16:11 through 12. Again, I'm going to cover such thoughts in my future book project. No, I've already covered it. Again, in Carnal Ordinances Part 2, where I show how the house of man did become dead men's bones thereby. Matthew 23:27.